Hi, welcome back. This time I'm going to do a stained glass lamp shade with flat glass marbles. You know those ones that a lot of people use with plants or with fish tanks? So starting off, I got a big styrofoam ball and cut it flat at the bottom. Next, I mixed a solution of silicone. This is just basic liquid silicone used for making molds. I'm using silicone to coat the styrofoam because a lot of heat resistant pads that you use to do soldering on are made out of silicone, and I wanted to protect the foam. My thought is that way it won't heat up as much and melt the foam, but the foam will allow me to pin and hold my pieces of glass in as I'm working. So yeah, this was just a experiment, and it worked out pretty good. That ring of styrofoam at the bottom, I ended up just removing that and not using it. So I'm trying to spread out the silicone as I go, turning my table. It really didn't take that much. Just that one little cup, I think it was. I put it on the 4-ounce line. I just tried to spread it out as much as I could so it was even. And then I let it dry overnight. Any extra I had, I poured on the top. And kind of like drooled down the sides. You can buy this silicone liquid in clear. This obviously is a blue silicone mixture I'm using. After placing the metal hoop or some kind of metal ring for the top, I started with large glass globs, and I pinned these around using regular straight pins till I had an even array of my objects, and then I'm putting flux on them and soldering them on. You could also use a bought lamp fixture for the top, but you need something for the middle of the top. That yellow thing is my exhaust fan that I have over it. I'm using a gel flux and a 40-60 mix solder. And then I add a ring of smaller globs, and I place these with my pins, sometimes using stick pins or those regular dress pins that you saw. And I place them where I think I'd like them and solder them into place. It's good to have a whole bunch of glass globs that you're planning on using available, because they come in variety of sizes, just slight variety, and you can mix and match to make them fit where you want to. All of these globs have been foiled. I'm using black backed 7/32 inch foil that I have cut down. For this project, I cut the foil down to 1/3 of its width to wrap around my globs. Now I use more wire or wire hoops, and I add them as rings to help support and to add to the design. I use right now I'm using another wire as a measurement device to make sure that my wire hoop that I'm creating is symmetrical to the center circle, because I want it to always measure the same amount as it's going out from the center. So I have a little wire that I made a loop on it, and I'm using that as a indication of where I want to put my wire hoop. See, those are some push pins, and they go very nicely into the foam, holding it secure. And I'm just wrapping, going around in a circle as I go to create the wire hoop. I often use wire hoops that are used for macrame or other projects. You can buy them at Hobby Lobby or Amazon, all different places. And I then take the wire hoops and I wrap the wire hoops with foil. Now, this particular wire I'm using right now, I've already tested it to make sure that solder would adhere to it. You don't want to just use any old wire that you find, because some wires are not very easy to get solder to stick to. So if you're not sure, just practice with a piece of your wire to see if it accepts solder. Now I'm filling in any gaps I have between the glass globs that I had to begin with and my new wire that I just added, and I'm filling the spaces with these smaller shapes. So some of these shapes are not round. There's kind of irregular globs of glass, but they come in variety of colors. And I foiled up a bunch of them. I believe I used probably a quarter of a width of regular 7/32 inch foil for them, because they're a lot smaller. Most of this video is shown in 8 times normal speed, so it is a little slower, obviously, in when you're actually doing it. Now you got to watch out your metal stick pins or sewing pins that you use will solder themselves if you have them too hot, too close to the heat source. Yeah, they will become one with your project. So you might want to move them out of the way before you actually do the soldering. Yeah, it's kind of a balancing act to get the little parts not to fall when you're trying to solder them. At this point, I'm trying to make that end of my wire one with the rest of it so it makes more of a hoop. So I'm just soldering them together. There, now it's attached. Now I just want to make sure I don't heat up that wire too much or it'll snap apart again. So as you can see, I have a lot of irregular shapes that I have foiled up just for this project. And I'm going to have to foil up some more because I used a lot of them making this lampshade. Now, any gap that is too small for the glass shapes that I have, I fill those gaps with solder so they end up just being basically the seams. So I put flux all around any areas that I need to fill up and just start putting solder in them. Once now and then you'll find an area that you can add another piece of glass, or sometimes a piece of glass will pop out, because remember, I'm using a very thin stripe of foil around these glass globs. So it is possible that it just wasn't enough to hold the glass in place. You can see I have there over on the left there, I have a bunch of really small stones that I have foiled up. The more areas that I can fill up with glass or the blue stones, the less I have to fill with solder. Plus, it looks nicer to have a lot of little stones instead of just large areas of black solder. If you're having trouble filling a gap, try to drop a piece of solder and then come back a minute or so later after that solder's cooled down some, because if you try to fill a space that is too large all at once, the hot solder is just going to melt away, it's fall off your project. It's not going to let you use it as a fill. So sometimes you have to drop in one little blop and then come back and drop another one and then try to smooth them over afterwards. Yeah, sometimes I use the actual piece of solder to kind of hold something in place while I'm trying to solder it on. Now I took the shade off of my foam circle and turned it over so I could back solder it. This will fill in any gaps. It'll help strengthen any areas that are weak, and it'll also make it look better. Not that you really need to see the inside of a lampshade, but any excess solder, especially when you try to fill a gap, you might end up with some extra solder that's just kind of piled up on the inside. You can keep that extra solder and use it for other times when you're soldering. So it's not really a waste. You just kind of leave it on your table for now. I'm also trying to get rid of any excess solder that was kind of overlapping the back of some of the globs, because I don't really want that. I want to be able to see through all the globs that I have. See, I'm using some of the solder that fell off that's on the table and just kind of picking it up with my solder iron when there's a space that needs extra solder. So I'm going to go around the whole top area that I have created and touch up the back. So at this point, I am going back and forth from the back of my creation and then going back and looking at the top side and just trying to get it so that it's what I want. That right there was a stone um, that fell off, and so I'm just putting a new one in place. At this point, I wanted to add another hoop so I could place the next row of glass. I didn't have a hoop again that was exactly what I wanted, but I did have one that was close. So I used it and adjusted it. You can see I used some wires to adjust it to the right size. Um, and it's a pretty sturdy hoop. So I wanted to use that instead of some wire again, because these next row I have these long oval shapes that I wanted to use, and I wanted to be able to hold them up pretty strongly with that hoop. I'm trying to place these somewhat evenly around my circle, my lampshade, and use them as a different variety to my design. So I soldered them at the top to the existing glass globs and hoop, and now I'm soldering them to the base. As you can see, I tried to do one every 45 degrees of the lampshade, and now I'm filling in between the oval shapes with some miscellaneous blue globs. And if an area seems to be too small for me to add one of my smaller glass pieces, then I will just fill it with solder as I go if it's convenient. I continued adding glass and hoops until I had the desired look. I think I made another 2 rows, and then another hoop, and then another row. And then I decided that this was the size I wanted for my shade. Now the bottom edge of the lampshade needs to be reinforced with wire. This is so that your globs don't fall off. I'm using 22 gauge copper wire. This is a great gauge for this because it's strong yet flexible. And I'm going to have to bend it around every glass glob that's there, so I want it to be pretty flexible. Now I'm using my fingers, I'm using a plastic probe, I'm using my solder iron, different things at different times to get that shape, because I want this wire to not really show up like, oh, she outlined the bottom of her lamp with wire. No, so I want it to pretty much hide in the design. So I want it to follow the contour very nicely around the bottom. Now, if you don't do this, your glass shapes might just fall right off during time, because glass is pretty heavy, especially these globs, and that's a lot of weight when you consider I just used a very thin piece of foil when I foiled my glass. So there's not a whole lot holding these together anyway, so it needs some help. I have used thicker wire at times when the contour is not as drastic as this, but for something that actually bends and you want to mold around it, a 22 gauge is just, I think, optimum. Yeah, that time I was using my fingernail to get that shape. Usually I would tack it on the end near the free end and then continue filling in where needed. Turning your project over or taking it off the actual styrofoam can make it easier to do this final rim of wire. As you can see, a lot of the foil hasn't even been coated with solder yet. So right now I'm continually going around the bottom of my project. So you can tack it in place and then just run a bead along the bottom of the wire. If your wire does have little gaps where you didn't bend it quite exact, you can just add more solder there. But it's best to make it as close fitting to the contour as possible. Yeah, those are scraps of solder on my table that have fallen off, and yeah, I use them when I can. Once I finished putting the wire around the whole bottom, I then continued to back solder the inside of the lamp. This again is to make the seams and the solder joints stronger and to cover any of the foil or wire and hoops that haven't been soldered yet. So I'm just smoothing over everything that needs to be worked on. You also want to make sure that there's any extra solder that is overlapping the back of your glass globs, that you clear that off so that you'll be able to see through all your glass. You can see that some areas there's too much solder and some areas there's not enough. That's why we do this. I cut the center of an old lampshade um, so that I could use that center part to hold up the shade itself. So as you can see here, that little like triangle three prong area I got from this lampshade that I had on hand. And then I can use that hoop that I'm not using for that for a different project. Now I want to patina it. I've decided that I want a black patina for this project. So after putting it on plastic, make sure you're wearing gloves for this. The stuff is very toxic to your hands. I'm using Novocaine black patina. And I like to put it in a spray bottle and spray it on. Some people like to dab it on. Some people just scrub it on with a brush. I usually start off with spraying a light coat on my project and then I scrub it in. So I'm spraying from different directions so that I don't miss any little gaps. Now I turned my lampshade over, and I'm going to lightly spray this side. As you can see from the puddle on my plastic, it's not really wasting very much at all using the spraying method. I'm also using the excess that is on my plastic to scrub in. And I'm going to use this toothbrush and scrub the patina all over so that it's completely covered. After I'm done with this, I usually let it sit for a little bit while I'm cleaning up some other parts of my project, and then I rinse it with cold water, then dry it off. At this point, you want to dry your project and then rub in some finishing polish or some wax to finish it up. This right now I'm using this Mother's wax that people use on their cars, but there's many different products out there that you can use to try to give it a nice finish. So I'm scrubbing on this substance. I'm using a clean toothbrush, and then I'm going to just rub it off and get it nice and shiny looking. And that's it. It's done. And here is my lamp when it's completed. And I thought it was a fun project. Thank you for watching. See you next time.